Let's work with chain-stitched cast-ons, embellishments, and bind-offs on the Corona bulky knitting machine. I'm working on a CN9. Most of the models will be very similar. A free dishcloth pattern is included in this video, and you may certainly make it on other machines, as long as you know how to set your machine to hold, to knit back from hold, and for a free pass across without knitting. This cloth may be 6, 7, or 8 inches square. Take note of the number of stitches that will be involved for each size so you can choose what you want. After knitting, washing, and drying, the gauge in any worsted weight cotton yarn should end up about 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch, and I believe that close is good enough for a dishcloth. We'll be chain stitching around the needle shanks to create the cast on, and using the transfer method to create the bind off. These two are not identical, but they're a reasonably good match for a project like this. Some additional chain stitching will be used to help stop rolling at the top and bottom of the fabric, and an easy tucked purl technique will be used at the left and right edges to stop rolling. I've been knitting worsted weight, otherwise known as number 4 yarns, at stitch size 6 on this machine, but cottons always require a looser stitch size because they're going to shrink and loft, and I did well with 8. I think for most bulkies, you're going to want something in the 7 to 8 range, probably key plate 4 for bonds. So let's cast on around the needle shanks by placing a loop of yarn onto the latch tool and working chain stitches around the needle shanks. I like to bring my needles all the way forward for this, no matter which bulky I'm using. And the trick for all machines is to keep those chain stitches loose. Remember that your carriage has to knit back through what you make, the chain stitch that you make, and it's going to have a very difficult time if you make your stitches tight. Also, the very end stitch is likely to be difficult, so I like to put it on and then manually knit a stitch through it so that the chain stitch, the final one, doesn't tend to tighten up, restricting the needle. Now thread the main yarn into the carriage, the same yarn that we worked across with. Set the carriage to knit back from hold. On the CN9, that's the knit setting and the number 2, and knit 3 rows. Now remove the yarn from the carriage without cutting it, and we're going to use that same main yarn to work a row of chain stitches across the purl side of the fabric. The purl side is facing us, so it's easily accessible. We'll just bring the needles all the way forward so that we can again work around the needle shanks. Pick up the working yarn with your latch tool and give the tool a little twist so that there is a complete loop of yarn around the latch tool, and then do exactly what we did to cast on. Work a row of chain stitch around the needle shanks, making sure that it's not too tight, and also manually knitting off the last stitch so that it isn't difficult for the machine to knit off. Now the carriage is on the wrong side, so we need to set it for a free pass. On the CN9, that's pass and number 1. Now the yarn and the carriage are on the same side, so we can rethread it and knit 3 more rows. It will feel a little bit stiff because of knitting off 2 sets of cotton yarn stitches, but mine is feeling a little bit too stiff, and in a moment I realized that and I stopped to lubricate. Corona bulky knitters, take note of this. I haven't had this trouble much with acrylic, but there's a little bit of a tendency for the cotton fabric to get curled up and hang up. So I tried adding some weights, which my standard gauge Corona really doesn't like. I tried it later in this project, and actually the machine put up with it just fine. Now again, we're going to chain stitch across around every needle shank in order, making sure to be loose enough that it's easy for the machine to knit through. Remember to manually knit the far right stitch so that it doesn't tighten up on the far right needle. Again, set the carriage for a free pass and move it to the right. Now set it for normal knitting and knit one row to the left. The next step that I'm going to show you is not actually essential, but it's going to make the edge trim easier to accomplish. So remove the third stitch from each end onto a piece of waste yarn. Pull the waste yarn through so it's holding the stitch, and drop the stitch off of the needle. Leave the needle in work with its latch open to make absolutely sure that it will knit in the future. On most machines, it will automatically open and knit. That's just a fail-safe. Anytime I've done pretty much anything, I always knit back from hole just to make sure all the needles are aligned and get the message. So I'm doing that here, but it's not actually a requirement. And then we're going to knit the body of the cloth. This is 30, 36, or 42 rows, depending on which size of cloth you're knitting. Do not be dismayed about the smears you now see on the needle bed. I'm trying out a heavy-duty silicone lubricant. I put it all underneath the carriage, and sometimes it does leave little deposits like that. So far, it appears to be completely harmless. I'll report on that later. When your straight rows are complete, drop the third stitch from one end and ladder it down to the piece of yarn that's holding it. We placed that yarn in position specifically to make it easy to find the right stitch to start the trim from. Insert the tool in that stitch, slide the tool behind 2 rungs of the ladder, grab the second of the 2 and pull through. We're creating a column of tuck stitches. This will go a long way towards controlling rolling, and for cotton yarns, it's usually plenty. When you reach the top rung of the ladder, pull it through and hang it back on the original needle. Do the same thing on the other edge of the knitting. Now, to make the top edge a mirror image of the bottom edge, we're going to repeat the chaining across that we did every 3 rows at the bottom. Twist, wrap, chain across, work the last stitch manually, move the carriage across with a free pass, knit 3 rows. Do that one more time and knit 3 rows. The carriage and main yarn will end up on the left, so transfer the leftmost stitch to the next needle over, then manually work a stitch, pull it back to the same length every time to the degree that you can manage it, and you'd be surprised. It gets quite easy to create even stitches working by eye and fingertip feel. Now I'm starting out using the single prong tool, which is the classic way of doing this. But I find that if you do it in the classic way, which would be pulling all the way back to create the stitch, on the Corona machine, it doesn't reliably complete the stitch to my satisfaction. So I think it is easier to work the needles by hand. And once you get the hang of doing that, see, I'm wrapping, grabbing the fabric, then I can pull the needle through the stitch, no problem. And if I'm going to do that, I just as soon switch to fingertips for all of the control. Make a completely manual row of stitches. I find it faster than the transfer tool. There's nothing better or worse about either method. It's just an option to consider if you have the same experience that I do. When you're all the way across, snip the yarn and pull the tail through the final stitch. If you notice an oddity in the row count, this is why. The top and bottom 3 rows will flip to the back. So to keep the cloth square, I recommended 6 extra rows. Weave in your yarn tails and you're done. This is an easy, quick project that allows us to practice several techniques and still produce something useful.